Right now in BC real estate, the rules around what your agent has to tell a buyer about your property, well, they have completely changed. And if you don't understand the difference about what you are required to disclose when selling versus what your agent is required to disclose, you could either end up in serious trouble or worse, you may think your agent is working against you. Just recently, the BCFSA has introduced new guidance to agents about how to handle sellers not wanting to disclose material latent defects about a property to unsuspecting buyers. This means that as a seller, you may not think you have to inform buyers about problems with your home or property, and while you may or may not be right. But in fact, it's your agent who will be forced to disclose them anyway, even against your wishes. And if you're a buyer, this change could affect the difference between uncovering a costly hidden defect or getting stuck with a nightmare money pit property after the fact. So subscribe to the channel if you like learning about BC real estate, and don't forget to disclose your like for this video. And know that if you need help in the Greater Vancouver real estate market, well, you can book a call with me right now using the first link in the description below. First, a little bit of background. Recently, there was a lawsuit in BC between a home buyer and a home seller. The buyer of the property sued the seller after the fact because they found out that a room was added to the house as an addition without the required permits. Now, one of the questions raised in the lawsuit was, did the seller know about the room being built without permits, or were they also not aware? But more importantly, was it or how was it disclosed to the buyer? So as a seller of a property here in BC, it's most common that you would fill out a form called the Property Disclosure Statement. I've covered this form and intricacies of it many times here on the channel before, because it always seems to be changing. But this form is not mandatory. And it's common that if you don't live in the property, if it's been vacant for some time, if it's been a tenanted property, or the seller might be elderly, that no disclosure would be made. So it would be industry norm that the seller would simply strike out this form altogether with a line written through the page and just sign on the last page and then notate the reason why no disclosure was being made. For example, maybe the seller did not live in the property. And that is actually exactly what happened in this most recent lawsuit. The seller crossed out the PDS, therefore making no disclosure at all. And the first time around, the judge agreed. The seller made no disclosure, therefore the buyer should have not relied on the disclosure and exercised extra caution and due diligence before moving ahead with the purchase. But upon appeal, the courts reversed that decision, citing that the defects with the property was a material latent defect, a defect that is not only hidden, but could cost the new owner significant financial loss or render the home uninhabitable. And a seller must disclose a defect of this manner. Well, this ruling has actually turned the real estate industry here in BC upside down, because the court also determined that crossing out of the PDS doesn't exactly mean that you are denying all disclosures altogether, and that somehow the buyer may still rely on you knowing more about the property because of the way this form is constructed. Now, I don't understand all of the details and how this could be construed in this manner. I find this part actually quite confusing myself. But it wasn't just me that found this part confusing. It also confused organized real estate. So PDSs are still a thing. The property disclosure statement still remains. But in the event that you don't want to fill out a property disclosure statement, striking them out is no longer best practice, and it could actually end you up in a whole lot of trouble. Well, enter the BCREA and this new form titled the Property No Disclosure Statement. This is a new form that is making it clear that the seller, while they're not making any disclosures at all, and as the form says, in lieu of a detailed property disclosure statement, that's the form I was previously talking about, the seller is not making any representations or warranties about the property. The seller is aware of their obligations to still disclose any known latent defects. So sure, we have a new form, but would it have really actually helped in this case that has shaken up BC real estate? Because the seller would have still needed to fill out a different form. The seller's disclosure of material latent defects form, which was available before this case, but the seller and their agent seemingly did not take advantage of it. So it is possible that the seller was trying to cover up that there was a defect with the property. Or maybe it was an honest mistake and they didn't know that it was a defect, or they didn't know their obligation to disclose the defect. I can't say for certain. But here's the craziest part. The seller is required to disclose any material latent defect, but is not required to disclose a lot of other things. And often the seller has no idea what they are required or not required to share with any prospective buyer. As such, the seller's material latent defect form is now gone, and it's been completely replaced with the realtor's disclosure of material latent defects. Now, if you're blown away by this as I was when I heard it, let me explain a little further. As we know, a seller must disclose any material latent defect, but isn't required to disclose other things. But a licensed real estate agent under Section 59 of the Real Estate Services Rules is required to disclose defects like if they know the property is unfit for the buyer's intended use, costly defects, government remediation notices, or of course, absences of required permits. So in other words, as a seller, you may know something about your own property, but it's your agent's duty not only to discover those things, like an unpermitted addition, but then also disclose those defects to any buyer who's considering making an offer. This is because under the real estate services rules, the licensees are held to a higher standard than the owner themselves, even though it's more likely that the owner would know something that is wrong with the property and be willing to cover it up. And if a seller asks an agent like me not to disclose that defect, at that time, we as agents are then required to stop providing services to that seller client altogether. I've actually had this happen to myself personally in my career. Years ago, I had a seller client who wanted me to cover up the fact that the property they were trying to sell used to be used as a marijuana grow-op. I obviously refused this as I knew it had to be disclosed, and I was promptly fired by that seller for doing so. And then only a week later, they had hired another agent, didn't tell them about the previous grow-op history at all, and the property was sold to an unsuspecting buyer. And do you want to know the worst part? Because client confidentiality never legally ends, I was not able to warn any prospective buyers of that property, nor was I able to tell the regulating body or the real estate board. I had to sit there with my mouth shut while I knew a buyer was getting screwed. So as a seller, please don't try to cover up this type of defect because it's your agent's requirement to disclose them anyway. You can, of course, choose to sign the property no disclosure form. It is your right, and I advise absentee owners myself or seniors or landlords to do so. But to both realtors and to sellers, make sure you understand your obligation to provide the new Realtor's Material Latent Defect form. If you know about the property, do what's right. Fill out the property disclosure statement correctly. And check out this video right now to learn more about the dreaded material latent defect so you don't have to be worried about disclosing something incorrectly when it's your time to sell in the future. And honestly, it's probably even more important that you understand this as a buyer.